They called it the cradle of democracy, the birthplace of philosophy, the fountain of art and architecture. But ancient Greece was also a civilization of shadows. Beneath the marble statues and poetic myths was a world of sexual customs that modern eyes would find deeply disturbing. Customs that reached far beyond the city-state's borders, leaving imprints on lands and peoples they touched, including parts of Africa. And while history often polishes Greece into a gleaming jewel of civilization, what lies beneath the shine is not just uncomfortable, it's horrifying to the Athenians. Human sexuality was not hidden in whispered tones or guarded by strict codes, as in later Christian societies. It was woven into religion, politics, and education, yet not in a way that fostered mutual respect. For them, power and sex were intimately linked, often in ways that exploited the most vulnerable. In many Greek city-states, sexual relationships between older men and adolescent boys were not merely tolerated, but institutionalized. This practice, called paiderasty, was framed as mentorship, a noble passing down of wisdom. But strip away the romanticized language, and it reveals a truth of systemic exploitation. Older, powerful men taking the bodies of young boys who had no power to say no. Now imagine this practice not contained to Athens or Sparta, but spreading wherever Greek influence went, through colonies, along the Mediterranean, into North Africa, and across trade routes that touched African soil. Carthage, Cyrene, and even the bustling port cities of Egypt saw the mingling of Greek settlers and local peoples. And as Greek soldiers, merchants, and officials arrived, so too did their cultural customs, including their sexual ones. In these encounters, the imbalance of power was stark. The Greeks came with armies, wealth, and political dominance, and in societies where enslaved people were traded like cattle, Africans often bore the brunt of their desires. Enslaved African boys and girls in Greek households had no protection from the sexual appetites of their masters. To the Greek mind, slaves were property, and property could be used however one wished. Ancient plays and writings, which modern readers often skim over, contain casual jokes about assaulting slaves. Jokes meant to amuse wealthy audiences who saw nothing wrong with it. For Black Africans caught in this web, dignity and bodily autonomy were stripped away, leaving wounds that were not just physical but generational. And there was another, darker layer. In many Greek religious festivals, sexuality was not only public, it was ritualized. Fertility rites honoring gods like Dionysus or Aphrodite sometimes involved acts that blurred the line between celebration and violation. During certain festivals, the social order was loosened, and slaves, foreigners, and women were made into living symbols of fertility, paraded or used in ways that treated their bodies as objects for the crowd's entertainment. For Africans living under Greek influence, this was more than cultural shock. It was the crushing realization that their humanity could be erased in the name of ritual. Yet, history's tragedy is never one-sided. There is always resistance, even in the smallest acts. In the port city of Naucratis in Egypt, where Greek merchants settled under the blessing of pharaohs, African mothers warned their daughters about foreign men who offered gifts in exchange for companionship. Some young boys, taken as household servants, learned to slip away at night, hiding among sympathetic dock workers or fishermen until the danger passed. There were whispers of Nubian guards who, when ordered to procure youths for Greek patrons, would deliberately mislead them, protecting their own people from harm. These acts might seem small, but in a world where refusing could mean death, they were acts of courage. Still, the violence left scars. Sexual exploitation was often a silent weapon of control. It robbed individuals of the right to define their own bodies, and it planted seeds of shame and mistrust that could fracture communities for generations. In many African societies that had once celebrated sexuality as part of life, where courtship was communal and marriage rites were sacred, the intrusion of Greek sexual customs introduced a new pattern. Sex tied not to love or fertility, but to power, dominance, and humiliation. And there's an uncomfortable truth modern history books rarely touch. When we celebrate the spread of Greek culture through art, theater, and governance, we must also acknowledge what else was spread. Conquest never comes without cultural exchange, but it is not always the conquered who benefit. For Africans in the orbit of ancient Greece, the price of contact was not measured in Conian, lost wars, or stolen resources. It was measured in the stolen innocence of children, the silenced cries of enslaved women, and the lingering belief, fostered by centuries of domination, that some bodies exist only for the pleasure of others. But here is where the story turns, because to understand the past is not only to mourn it, but to reclaim what was taken. Across African history, from the kingdoms of Kush to the Berber tribes of the Maghreb, people found ways to reclaim dignity. They revived their own customs, reshaped them in the face of foreign influence, and taught the next generations to see themselves not as property, but as descendants of proud and sovereign peoples. This reclamation did not happen in a single year or under a single leader. It was the work of countless unnamed individuals, mothers, fathers, elders, who chose to pass on a different story than the one their oppressors told. And so, as we look back at ancient Greece, the philosophers, the poets, the statesmen, we must also look at the shadows they cast. The horrifying sexual practices of their world were not confined to their borders, and their legacy is not just marble and myth. It is also the quiet resilience of those who endured, those who refused to be defined solely by the violence done to them. This is the part of history that rarely makes it into textbooks, but it is the part that must be told, for without it, we risk believing in a golden age that was never truly golden for all. The conquests of Alexander the Great spread Greek influence far beyond the Aegean. His armies marched into Egypt, Persia, and as far as India, but it was in Africa that the Greek presence took deep and complicated root. Cities like Alexandria became centers of learning and trade, but also of exploitation. The same sexual practices that had been normalized in Athens and Sparta, ritualized sexual displays, and the routine abuse of enslaved bodies, were woven into the fabric of these new cultural crossroads. In Alexandria's great harbor, African traders from Nubia, Ethiopia, and the interior met Greek merchants. Goods changed hands: gold, ivory, spices. But so too did human beings. Slave markets flourished under Greek rule, and among the enslaved, young African boys and girls were often valued not just for labor but for their bodies. In Greek eyes, the darker the skin, the more exotic the allure. A twisted fetish that reduced people to objects of curiosity and desire. And as the Greek Empire gave way to Rome, the customs persisted. The Romans admired Greek art, Greek philosophy, and Greek education. But they also inherited the darker legacy, Roman elites kept Greek tutors for their children, Greek sculptors for their villas, and, quietly, Greek sexual practices in their private lives. For Africans in the Roman world, this meant that exploitation became a generational constant. A child taken from Nubia to serve in Alexandria might be sold years later to a Roman household in Carthage, where the cycle of abuse began anew. By the time Islam began to spread across North Africa in the 7th century, these patterns had already been embedded for centuries. While Islamic teachings formally forbade many of the sexual excesses of earlier pagan societies, cultural habits do not vanish overnight. In port cities like Tripoli and Tunis, where Greek and Roman influences had long mingled with Berber and Arab traditions, older patterns of power and sexuality often persisted in hidden ways. Here is the part history rarely admits. Cultures, even when conquered, leave behind more than ruins. They leave habits, attitudes, and ways of seeing the world, some of them corrosive. The Greek habit of linking sexual access to social dominance did not simply die with the fall of their city-states. It seeped into the practices of those who came after, shaping hierarchies where darker-skinned peoples, particularly Africans south of the Sahara, were more likely to be placed at the bottom, their bodies still seen as commodities. And yet, throughout this long shadow, African communities found ways to fight back. In the highlands of Ethiopia, where Greek merchants occasionally ventured, strict local customs guarded marriage and sexual relations, placing heavy shame on those who violated them. In West Africa, far from the Greek sphere, oral traditions carried stories of distant foreigners who brought strange and dangerous ways. Stories that served as warnings to the young. Even in the bustling cosmopolitan quarters of Alexandria, free black artisans and merchants formed tight-knit networks to protect their children from predatory households. But the weight of history is stubborn. When European colonial powers arrived in Africa centuries later, they encountered societies already touched, however faintly, by Greek and Roman sexual legacies. The idea that power granted the right to sexual access had been reinforced across eras and empires, and in some cases, the fetishization of African bodies by outsiders, which began in those ancient slave markets, re-emerged in the racist science and colonial exploitation of the 19th century. This is not to say that the Greeks invented all such practices. Exploitation has taken many forms in many places, but rather that their cultural prestige helped normalize them in the ancient world. When the poets and philosophers of Greece were praised for their wisdom, their sexual customs were often quietly excused, even imitated, canned. And so, when those customs harmed African peoples, the harm was legitimized not only by force, but by the aura of civilization. It is here we must pause and ask, what does it mean to inherit a legacy? For Africa, the legacy of ancient Greece is complex. There is no denying the brilliance of their mathematics, their drama, their political thought, some of which Africans themselves adopted and adapted, but alongside those came the darker inheritance. The belief that sexual domination was a natural extension of social power, and that those at the margins could be used without consent, cut. And yet, if history teaches us anything, it is that legacies are not fixed. They can be challenged, reshaped, even broken. Across the continent, African writers, historians, and elders have worked to strip away the shame imposed by centuries of exploitation, replacing it with stories of resilience. In modern Egypt, scholars reclaim the African roots of Nile Valley civilizations, pushing back against narratives that center only the Greek contribution. In Senegal and Nigeria, artists and poets confront the fetishization of black bodies head-on, transforming pain into art that refuses to be silenced. Even in the diaspora, in the Americas, in Europe, descendants of those who endured ancient and modern exploitation are telling their stories, reframing themselves not as victims but as survivors. They are saying, in voices that carry across oceans, we are not defined by what was done to us. We are defined by what we built, what we preserved, and what we refused to let die. And perhaps that is the most important connection to make when we look at the horrifying sexual practices of ancient Greece. We cannot change what happened in the slave markets of Alexandria or the private chambers of Athenian elites. But we can refuse to let those acts be remembered only as curiosities of history. We can name them for what they were, violations of human dignity, and we can honor those who endured them by telling their stories in full, without polishing away the pain. The marble statues may still stand in museums. The poetry may still be recited in classrooms, and the philosophers may still be quoted by leaders. But now, alongside the praise, there must also be truth. A truth that acknowledges that civilization is not measured only by its art and ideas, but by how it treats the most vulnerable. And by that measure, ancient Greece's legacy is far more complicated than the myths allow. For the people of Africa, and for all people, the lesson is clear. We cannot control what legacies we inherit, but we can decide which ones we keep. We can take the courage of those who resisted in silence and make it loud. We can strip away the power of those who once believed they owned our bodies. And in doing so, we ensure that the horrors of the past are not repeated, but transformed into a history that strengthens rather than shames. Because history, at its best, is not simply a record of what happened. It is a weapon, a mirror, and a guide. And if we choose to see it clearly, shadows and all, we can walk forward not as inheritors of the cruelties of ancient Greece, but as the heirs of every act of defiance that kept human dignity alive against impossible odds.